It's time to explore the world according to Glenn. I'm Kevin Jacobsen. Glenn Close is my favorite actress, and this show is all about exploring the career of one of the finest actors of her generation. Each episode, I'll be joined by a guest as we dive into one of Glenn's movies, TV shows, or stage productions, going chronologically through her career, discussing her performance, and assessing the project itself. And today, we are talking Glenn's Oscar nominated performance in Albert Nobbs.
Eight-time nominee Glenn Close, motherfuckers.
My guest today, I am so excited to finally have on The World According to Glenn, one of the biggest Glenn fans I know. He joined me on And the Runner-Up Is, where we covered the 1972 Best Actress race. Writer of the great Oh Shut Up Substack. Welcome to the show, Marco Donovan.
Thank you, Kevin, for that lovely introduction. I feel this business of being the biggest Glenn Close fan is literal, not figurative, because yeah, I
Fair.
yeah, I suppose, Glenn is so petite. I mean, even height-wise, she's I think 5 feet 4 inches. The reason I had this on my mind, I'm not, I don't think about Glenn Close's measurements as a rule. But it's, of course, we're recording this on the day of the Tony Awards, and
Mm-hmm.
Glenn's first debut on the Tony Awards as a 32-year-old ingenue was as Len Cariou's date when he won for Sweeney Todd, and she was incorrectly labeled on the telecast as Mrs. Len Cariou, and to this day that
Mm-hmm.
accompanies her, on IMDb or on all these other things as alternative names. And, quite frankly, I think Mrs. Len Cariou is better than Glenn Close. I think it's a distinguished name. It's like Mrs. Patrick Campbell, who was, Shaw's muse, or Princess Michael of Kent, and a very apt title for what we're talking about today, which is,
Yeah.
gender bending and things. No, but it's lovely to see you again, and I believe congratulations are in order too. Since last we talked, you've announced your Glengagement. And
Thank you. Yes.
I'm, quite sure that your wedding will be a great wonder. So,
A great wonder.
hmm,
It really will. Yes.
so
Thank you so much. Yeah.
no, not at all. God, I'm thrilled to be here though to talk about all
Yeah.
things Glenn.
Just think she could have been Glenn Cariou. And how interesting that would be. Lennon Glenn Cariou.
Well, it's funny because there's so many women of that generation. There's so
Hmm.
many of that women of that age who've become famous under married names. I mean, Susan Sarandon
Yeah.
is one.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I mean, I always do think Glenn Close is such a fabulous name. I mean, but it's important though what someone's name is. And I mean,
Yeah.
you look at her and you think that is Glenn Close, You'd never think of
Mm-hmm.
her and think that's, Esther Jones or something. It's,
Mm-hmm.
but no, yeah, this is, I think this film, not to preempt your next question, but in some ways, I think this film is the whole Glenesis of my sort of Glen lore, really.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember her coming to film this here in Dublin, God, 16 years ago now. And yeah, it was the great excitement of of that time.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, for the last 15 years or so, I have defended this film. I feel I'm the spokesbearer for the Albert Nobbs Appreciation Society. And I've always said things like, well, it has this reputation as sort of a Oscar punchline. It's the scapegoat for every awards bait, awful film. I mean, when Kate Winslet makes these, Lee Miller and the thing she made last year, she's likened to Albert Nobbs. It's a joke. I mean, no one ever says it when Bradley Cooper does it, let's face it. But
Hmm.
it's but as I said, for the last decade and a half, I have defended this film
Mm-hmm.
vehemently. And I watched it last night, and I think maybe I might change my tune on that point. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, it's funny actually because when Glenn got that star on the Walk of or in Grauman's Chinese the other week, and she had the retrospective in for the TCM festival. They
Yeah.
asked her what you probably know this, but they asked her what film of hers she wanted to show, and she said this one. And they said, "Oh,
Mm.
absolutely not. We're going to show Dangerous Liaisons." I mean, that's the gospel truth. If you look at the interview with Ben Mankiewicz, she says that Albert Nobbs was the film she would have liked to have chosen as her, career retrospective, and they said, "No, you will show Dangerous Liaisons or whatever." I think that was the second choice. In
I get it.
fairness, it
Yeah.
wasn't like, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And also how fitting that we're talking about Albert Nobbs during Pride Month, you know?
And that's always been the great thing about gender identity and sexuality, even from the time, George Moore wrote the story of Albert Nobbs. And in terms of Glenn, when she came out with this film, in some ways I thought it was ahead of its time. And then maybe
Hmm.
5 years later, I thought, oh God, if she only come out with this now, it would be so timely. And now, another whatever many years later, it feels totally inappropriate and totally, it wouldn't, even though, of course, she's not for one moment playing a man, she's, and she always had to have that sort of tactful balance of saying, I'm not playing a man, I'm playing a woman. She uses she pronouns. I mean, George Moore, because it was in various different anthologies and different iterations of the story. I mean, he always uses she, her pronouns for Albert. In later versions, there's some where he uses he ones, but it's an interesting sort of for Pride Month because I felt that when I was watching that about Glenn and the whole gay community or whatever that she always has. I mean, I know she'd summon up doing Serving in Silence with Judy Davis as the kind of the beginning of it, but. Yeah, I mean, Garp is the same with, John Lithgow. She always has these things that I suppose were very noble in their time, but in a
Yeah.
2026 lens, they obviously would get pushback. And I think maybe the
Hmm.
way this film doesn't is because, as I said, it's considered a stock punchline.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a fitting topic for Pride Month.
Mm.
You know, yeah. Sorry, I'm
Yeah.
wittering on.
You're raring to go to talk about this movie, but we have to stop down and get your origin story with Glenn
Mm.
Close because I'm so curious what your relationship is to her, what you love about her, and what your favorite performance is.
Well, I was listening with your episode with Izzy with Be Kind Rewind the other day, and I think
Mm.
it is that thing of projecting onto Glenn a sort of feeling of thwarted ambition, or not even ambition,
Yes.
but thwarted recognition, I suppose, that she is somebody that everyone, for no grander reason than having the most Oscar nominations. I mean, let's face it. I mean, she's such an accomplished, wonderful actress. I mean, and I hate it. I hate when she signs on to do a cameo in some dreadful film. Oh, this is going to be Glenn's Oscar. I would cringe at it. And
I know.
Annette Bening is the same, and they're all of them. I can't be doing with it.
Amy Adams.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
it's so reductive, and but it's funny because obviously, like everyone of my age, millennial or even a Glen Z, the first encounter, Glen counter, is of course Cruella. I mean, like let's face it, it is. For the last year I've been trying to think of an interesting answer I could give to this. Oh well, I saw Meeting Venus in, but it was Cruella. Like let's face it, on VH.
Immediate family. Yeah, of
On,
course.
on VHS. I
Right.
do remember seeing, I mean, I was probably a bit young to see the first one, in the cinema, but I do remember seeing the second one in the cinema.
Hmm.
The scene where she's baked into a cake really was my whole sort of, I think, sexual awakening. And
Mm.
it's, again, it's that sort of, I don't know, it was a kind of like a humiliation thing or something. But then I was so conscious of who she was. And again, through repeated suggestion, as Be Kind Rewind said, every video that you put in as a child would have that trailer for 101 Dalmatians on it, with Glenn Close is Cruella de Vil. And, that sort of thing. Because, I mean, what else would I have been seeing of her as a young person, really? I mean, I think I probably can remember her face on maybe, DVD boxes when you rent something in sort of, in the frontier days when I was a child. But,
Mm.
I had this thing with even a pal of mine in school, in this dreadful school we went to, and we'd, get our exam results back and we'd say to each other, was it a Merrill or a Glenn? And if it was a Merrill, it meant you got an A. And if it was a Glen, it meant you got, a B or a lesser mark. But we used to say
Wow.
this, and like, how would we have known this? We knew her from nothing from Cruella. We had this idea that she was the second person. And it's so wrong, I mean, to think like that. But I suppose we had her as this in our own sort of language or our own collection of people, that she was always the kind of the person that was foiled at the 11th hour, or the person that, and for gay men especially, like, let's face it, they loved that. And
Hmm.
it's so at odds with the actual woman herself, because she's not some grand dame in real life. She's a batty lady that likes playing, throwing the tennis ball in the hotel with Pip the dog. She's not some scheming harridan. She's not Norma Desmond or Alex. But I think there is a kernel of that sort of, it's the imperiousness of her as a woman. I mean, I think the greatest example of that is her introducing Deborah Kerr at the Oscars when she gave her an honorary award. And by God, the woman is more imperious than Norma Desmond or any of them ever was. In that moment, just the little introduction. And I suppose that is what I always got from her, because it was that willingness. I know I said humiliation, but it was that willingness to be a little bit silly or make a bit of a fool of herself. And definitely in real life, she does that in spades. So I think that's how I learned about her before I'd seen all the films or whatever, because every time she'd be on a chat show in Jonathan Ross's chat show or Graham Norton or whatever, and she'd do these things. She'd pick her shoes off, and got even all the American chat shows, stuffing all the carrots into her mouth. These are the things that I would have seen as a,
Yeah.
as a young person. And I don't know, I always thought there was something so kind of freeing about that. And there was something so attractive about her. Like, she was such a, I mean, I'm not saying she was a conventionally, beautiful sort of woman, but she was so handsome, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um,
But do you have a favorite performance of hers?
I think I do say Dangerous Liaisons just as a sort of the lesser of two evils, the Julianne lesser of two evils. Um,
Very
I,
good.
uh, with Fatal Attraction, or Fecal Impaction, as a comedian here used to call it, I always think it's that business with the ending being changed, so we can't pick that. We'll find out soon enough why we can't pick Albert Nobbs. And
Mm.
there's a reason why I wouldn't include the wife in it, because again, I think she's very imperious in the wife at the beginning, in a way that, when I was watching this, I said, God, it's so unlike the imperiousness of, Joan Castleman. I'm thinking of her saying, it's all real, darling, at the start. I mean, the only moment in Albert Nobbs where she's like that is you know, I mean, I'm not calling it a joke, but it's the great wonder. I mean, there's none of that apart from that in this. So maybe
Yeah.
Dangerous Liaisons is the all-purpose film. I quite like Reversal of Fortune though too, though I must say that's
Mm.
one I like, because I think it's so, her. I mean, everyone says it now, but I think it's predating Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs by a year. That short performance, that totally, because it's the economy. Cruella is the same in 101 Dalmatians. Her
Hmm.
screen time has got its cursory, but it's all anyone remembers, and that's why I, think with these origin stories now. I mean, they're basically Hitler not getting into art school, and yet Glenn understood that. I mean, I know it's a writing thing; it's not her, and sort of John Hughes plagiarizing lines from the cartoon and just sending them on. But it's the economy of her, because again, I always go on as though Glenn is always this overblown grand dame character. I know she takes great umbrage at that. I mean, she took great umbrage at people likening Norma Desmond to Cruella. She said, they're not alike at all. Anthony Powell dressed both of them. That's it. She didn't want, not trying to pigeonhole her as somebody that, plays the same role all the time. I mean, yourself, in every interview, she stresses about, oh, I've never done a character like this, in that Kim
Hmm.
Kardashian thing. I've never played a lovely, wonderful lawyer in a multi-series TV show. As you're finding out at the minute what you're currently watching, Damages for Slow Learners. Actually, it's
Sure.
the same wig she's wearing for
Yeah.
Damages in All's Fair.
Yeah.
But
She dusted off her shake and go wig
yeah,
and yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
I always just felt she was somehow, I don't know, outside that whole set of actresses, like the Merrills
Yeah.
and, Jessica Lange and Sarandon. I always felt Glenn was sort of like the not an outsider, she certainly wasn't, but there was just something of the other about her, and that goes for all of her roles, you know. And that's what I think. I'm not speaking for you, but I think a lot of sort of tragic gay men um, identify with that, you know, because I don't know, maybe is it not feeling threatened by it or something? I don't know.
Hmm.
It's like it's like thinking that all these villains would have. I mean, Cruella de Vil would adore you. You know, she'd hate some
I
mousy,
think so.
mousy woman that's going to give some awful man, two kids, but she'd love,
Hmm.
you or I. So I think it's that kind of identification with her, and then knowing at the same time that it's totally incongruous to what that woman is like in real
There you
life.
go.
And that's the same with Albert Nobbs, it's all about mirrors and it's all about, like the face you put out towards the world that's so different to the inner life. And I think that's the whole
Hmm.
the whole of her whole career on stage and screen and television. It's that's the whole thing about her. It's these, the many faces of Glenn Close can be the name of her memoir. Yeah.
Well, The World According to Glenn is what
Mm.
we're adapting, of
Yeah.
course,
Well, they
but
wanted to call this Glentle. They wanted to make it a musical, you see. But
of course.
I wish they called it just Albert. I
Hmm.
hate. I always say the reason that it has this reputation is the phallic title.
Yeah,
Because I mean that's how obvious it is. I mean that's of course
I
that's
know.
that's George Moore in 1918. It's not her, but it's funny because
Hmm.
something that is so blunt. I mean, she might as well be called Albert Cock or something. It's like but that's how like blunt it is, and yet it's so completely obvious, and yet so completely hidden or so whatever at the same time. And that can go for a lot of things with Glenn, past,
Yeah,
present, and future.
well said. Yeah, that's an incredible, I mean, that's an incredible summing up of her whole appeal, I think, actually, that not many people have been able to really put into words, I think, is that for me personally, I have felt, me doing and the runner up is was the whole appeal of kind of highlighting the person who was number two
Mm,
to a certain degree and who didn't get that shine.
mm,
And Glenn has certainly gotten her shine in many endeavors,
mm.
other than Oscars, of course, and Emmys and Tonys, but it still is like that thing of like, she is still incredible, and yet,
Yeah, I also think the other thing that is maybe a little bit relevant to uh,
mm,
to us, I'm talking as though we were bosom buddies, and I'm not sort of trying to surmise how old you are, but I always think it's so heartening that like she didn't make a film until she was 35, you know.
yeah, I
Um,
know.
so you and I have, I know, another 21 years
There's
to
still
do
hope.
it.
Hmm. Well, on that note, let me get into a big introduction here of Albert Nobbs. So, a lot to discuss here, obviously. We have Glenn here finally returning to film in live action for the first time since the aforementioned Evening in 2007, which was a very small role. You could go back to 2005 with Heights as her last movie with her in a somewhat decent role. Either way, it's been about half a decade since Glenn has been seen on the big screen, and this is a major return for her because Albert Nobbs is one of the major passion projects of her life. So, for some backstory, Albert Nobbs started as a novella from 1927 that was written by George Moore, telling the story of a waiter named Albert Nobbs working at a hotel in 19th century Dublin, and how, unbeknownst to those he works with, Albert was actually born female and has been male presenting for several years, so he could work as a waiter and be able to make more money in that way. So then, many years later, the late 70s, George Moore's novella was adapted to a stage play by Simone Benamoussa. So the play The Singular Life of Albert Nobbs premiered with Susanna York in the lead role in Britain. It then transferred off Broadway in 1982, where Glenn took on the role of Albert Nobbs. This was, in fact, the same year she made her film debut in The World According to Garp. So she won an Obie Award for her performance. And throughout her film career, she had been trying to get this film adaptation made, spending apparently 15 years trying to get it greenlit and financed. As she said in the production notes for the film, she said, "I think Albert is one of the truly great characters, and the story, for all its basic simplicity, has a strange emotional power. There's something deeply affecting about Albert's life. She never stopped continuing to move me. I became very busy in my career, but always thought that Albert's story would make a wonderful movie." So Glenn was very active in getting this off the ground. There were plans for István Szabó, her director on Meeting Venus, to make the film in the early 2000s, but financing didn't work out. She then approached producer Bonnie Curtis when they were working together on The Chum Scrubber. Shout out to The Chum Scrubber. And as Bonnie says, Glenn approached her with the script for Albert Nobbs and told her, I must play this part on the big screen before I die. So, kind of a threat, but it worked out. Meanwhile, she had done location scouting to find the right hotel to film in, and in Dublin, she refined the script. I mean, this was really her baby through and through. But to direct the film, she sought out Rodrigo Garcia, who had previously worked with her on Things You Could Tell Just by Looking at Her and Nine Lives, noting how great of a director he is at telling women's stories. So, Glenn also underwent extensive makeup and hair tests, changing the shape of her nose, making her ears bigger, wearing a wig, the whole 9 yards. It was a major undertaking, and Glenn was very intimately involved in so many different elements of the film, including writing an original song, which I hope to get into towards the end. But Glenn was filming Damages around this time, kind of worth noting too, because just how different these characters are of Patty Hughes and Albert Nobbs, but also because I think Glenn having this renaissance with Damages and winning Emmys really was part of what helped get the financing together, sort of a guarantor for her to make this passion project. So with all that said, to get into a quick summary of the film, Albert Nobbs is set in 19th century Dublin and tells the story of Albert Nobbs, played by Glenn, who has been working for decades as a waiter at the Morrison Hotel in Dublin. Albert is rather stoic and quiet and hasn't told a single soul of his history, having been born female and taking on a new identity as a man. So Albert's carefully constructed life is then disrupted when a painter named Hubert Page, played by Janet McTeer, arrives and is assigned to room with Albert. Hubert then discovers Albert's secret, which mortifies Albert, only for Hubert to reveal soon after that he too was born female and is living life as a man, and even has a wife. So that spurs Albert to try and make something more of his life, making plans to buy his own tobacco shop in town. He also courts Helen, played by Mia Wasikowska, a maid at the hotel, though Helen is having an affair with Joe, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, back when he was just Aaron Johnson. And he convinces Helen to lead Albert on a bit to get some money out of him. So anyway, yes, that's a basic summary of the film. Mark, as we have talked about, as a fellow Glenn fan, Albert Nobbs is a very loaded topic in Glenn's career. So yes, would love to know your history with this, how it's changed over the years, how this rewatch struck you, and your thoughts today on Glenn's performance.
Well, I saw this movie. I looked at it illegally on a sort of torrented link in December 2011, but I went to see the premiere of it in Dublin in February of 2012. So I did pay to see it once.
Okay.
But no, but I'm just saying that because I knew all that what was coming, and the Irish audience, and I knew the
Yeah.
bits they would cringe at, and even the president of Ireland and his wife were 3 rows behind us, and I knew the kind of sort of awful Irish accents and things that were coming, and I would look over when I knew that Janet McTeer was going to pull a Janet Jackson. You know, when she flashes herself. So I looked over to see all these dignitaries because I knew these things were coming. Um, this time, as I said, I have been defending it for 15 years without ever watching it. Well, I probably have caught bits of it on television and things, but it is one of those films that I don't.
Was it shown on television?
It was actually. It was shown on television one Christmas Eve. I remember
Okay.
looking at it drunk, and which
Nice.
didn't improve it at all.
Hmm.
But as you said, it was a novella, and then it was in a book in an anthology called Celibate Lives, or the French title was even better. It was Albert Nobbs, A Autre Vie Sans Hymen, Other Lives Without Hymens. I mean, a great title. Much better than Celibate Lives. But
Hmm.
nothing happens in it. It's George Moore and his friend are just telling the story because when Glenn played this on stage and in the Simone Ben Musa play, I mean, there's interviews of her saying that this was a real person. Albert Nobbs actually existed, and she's actually not half wrong on that. There was a case of a house painter in London that was exposed like this. And it was always said that the reason Albert Nobbs wasn't, it was so unbelievable, even as a short story, was the invention of the second, man woman, is what they would have said in the 1900s. I mean, they weren't at all PC. They said that's what defeated that this was believable because, the likelihood of finding a second one, of Hubert Page. But it's fun because, I was watching it now a little bit older and I thought this film, there is a sort of a queer thrust to it, I mean, even when you think of like Jonathan Rhys-Meyers and the other guy playing the aristocrats, that are clearly besotted with
Yeah.
each other. The screenplay, for the FYC purposes, they upload PDFs of all the screenplays every year, but it dates the screenplay as 1895, it's supposedly set in or 1898, sorry. But that's 3 years after the Oscar Wilde trials, so it does have this strange sort of queer energy, that's very it's like those two aristocrats can be all over each other, but yet the downstairs people are so repressed and so the promotional image they kind of used to sell this film, that kind of like the placeholder poster was of a corset, literally showing her being constricted, so I did appreciate that, but that didn't last for very long. I quite quickly saw the flaws in it because, as you said, it's the passion project, and I think the great thing that this film succeeds in, and I would say that it's the same for Alex Forrest as well. It's somebody that's a victim, but they don't have any self-pity or something. She says that they believe in the impossible dream, and that is the most. When the film is the most effective because as I said about that whole queer thing, the whole conflict in this story, I mean Glenn and John Banville, the great Irish writer, and Istvan Svabo, basically had to invent a plot for this thing. And the thing that they do that doesn't stand up, and even I'm someone that is contrary for the sake of it, and doesn't want to be PC. But the thing that really stuck in my craw in this rewatch was the whole why she is trans or not why she's trans, of
Yeah.
course, but it's that transphobic trope of she's
Mm-hmm.
this way because of a gang rape, and that has got extremely problematic. And I mean, no such thing
Yeah.
exists in either George Moore's short story or in the Simone Ben Musa. I mean, in that play, it's that she had a love affair with Mr. Congreve. But that was more of it. I mean, no one would believe that someone dressed as a man for 30 years because, the first person that smiled at her led her astray, Whereas I think something like the earlier scenes between Albert and Hubert, they are the place where you can have these interesting, discussions about gender and about whatever, about Victorian. I mean, because this society was just so ultra repressive. I mean, it was, that's what's interesting. It's those small moments. It's her rolling a cigarette. I mean, that's as much of a new experience for Albert Nobbs as
Mm-hmm.
kissing somebody or whatever. It's this woman that has never lived at all, and that's in those moments where I feel I can defend the performance and maybe not the
Mm-hmm.
film. But yet Glenn considers it the great one that stands
Yeah.
shoulder to shoulder. But it always feels like there's a caveat to it, and I wanted to come in and see this film last night and think there is no caveat to it. It's great, apart from the phallic title and Mia Wasikowska and Aaron Johnson. But I don't think I would, be so gung-ho to defend it now. So I was
Mm-hmm.
interested when you said when we were DMing each other the other night, and you said that you warmed to it, even since you've looked at
Mm-hmm.
it last. So I'm
Yeah.
fascinated to hear that.
Yeah. Well, I have a very complicated history with this movie. I did not even see it in 2011, if you can believe it. I think I was a bit turned off by some of the reviews, and the reception was just very mixed. A lot of people say, oh, it's just a dull period drama, vanity project. I kind of fell victim to that noise, essentially, even though I loved Glenn. Just wasn't really a priority for me for that reason. And I think also it was a very limited release. I might not have been able to actually see it
Mm.
in my town before even like I think I saw it after that Oscar season was even over. So then when I finally watched it, I can't say that I loved the experience very much. I remember thinking it felt very creaky, very claustrophobic, and maybe well intentioned, but clumsy in the overall message, to say the least. I was impressed with the makeup transformation with Glenn and Janet, but especially with Glenn. But I also just felt like I couldn't quite access what she was trying to do with the character. But at the same time, as my love for Glenn kind of accelerated around the time of The Wife, I did find myself getting annoyed with how dismissive people were of this movie, of that movie, and also Albert Nobbs. Because, yeah, to your point, it did feel like a punching bag for reasons that were in some ways justified, but in other ways, it just felt very mean spirited to me, especially knowing Glenn cared so much about this story, as we've said. And so when I rewatched it for the Best Actress series, didn't quite work for me there either, despite those good intentions. And it is fascinating how it's opened up a little bit more for me on this watch. I felt like I was able to see more of what Glenn and Rodrigo Garcia and everyone involved were really aiming for. I think as a film about gender expression and identity, it is flawed at best because it doesn't really engage with Albert's identity in a super confident way, and I think the messaging gets quite muddled as we learn more about the backstory there, and I think there are some rather glaring unforced errors, as you have alluded to, within that kind of take me out of it. But I do think that the film does provide some insight into what life was like for a woman and sort of seeing this through a feminist lens. I think it is, again, very telling that Glenn, in interviews, always refers to Albert as she and as a woman rather than saying that Albert is like a man or a trans man, which definitely could hit the ear wrong in a modern context. But from a historical context, when we didn't have those kinds of labels and vocabulary to discuss gender fluidity and trans identity, it sort of does track in the sense that Albert was living as a man, but I don't know if Albert understood themselves to be a man. But
Yeah.
so that's how Glenn sees it as well, is that she views Albert from the inside out, as she has said in interviews. Meaning people engaging with Albert in the world see a man and he is expressing himself as such, but Albert sees this for the most part as a means of survival in this patriarchal society and to escape the poorhouse, and might not actually see themselves as a man so much as this person is expressing themselves in that way, but may not truly believe they are male at their core. So it's a very tricky dynamic that I don't know if the film really engages with in a way to make that delineation clear enough to the audience, which is where it gets into that unforced territory, because this is a film coming out in 2011, and even at that time there were some evolving discussions about transness and gender identity that sort of lack of fully delving into the nuances of this in the film is what made some critics feel like it was reinforcing some harmful stereotypes about trans people expressing themselves one way, but deep down they are still just, whatever identity they were born as, or they're just playing dress up, or even that they're being deceitful to a certain degree, which is where it gets really harmful. And that's where I wish the film put a little more effort to make that distinction a bit, that Albert lives within a very limited framework of understanding their gender in a sense. But as a feminist story of, if we're saying like this is about women struggling to control their lives and doing so through different means, I do think it's a fascinating story, like seeing the parallels between Albert and Hubert and Helen, and really showcasing like the different ways that women or people who are born female tried to gain some control of their lives. It's just the issue is that this is coming out in 2011. You know what I mean?
Well, it's interesting because, just in the world at large, that we sort of swing between these sort of permissive societies and these ultra conservative ones. The Weimar Republic became, what it became. The 70s became the decade of Reagan. And I feel we're in a course correction like that now. Because when I was, as I said, I was a teenage, well, an older teenager when this film came out. And I think obviously because just being in Dublin and you couldn't move. I mean, you get Glenn on the toaster. I mean, they promoted this film so much here. But I suppose the only place where it got sort of maybe semi-serious consideration was in gay publications, like in the like of whatever, but even the local ones like the Gay Community News, but even in things like The Advocate that are, international things, that Glenn
Mm-hmm.
kind of got a sort of, even for, 15 years ago, she got like total acceptance about whatever her idea of Albert's identity was. Because it's funny when the Simone Ben Musa play was on stage in London and probably in New York too, there was an insert put into the playbill that said this play is not about a transvestite. That's the word they would have used. It's a play about precariousness and it's a play about whatever. I mean, Christopher Isherwood, who we talked about before, he included this play. He was asked to do an anthology of the greatest short stories ever written, and he included the short story, I mean, not the play, in this book.
Hmm.
And he even he said in his little introduction to it, he considered it one of the greatest short stories ever written, but he said it's not about lesbianism. They all used a different term, and they probably all thought they were so politically correct of the different eras. It's not about that.
Sure.
She dresses as a man to get a job and nothing more than that. And Glenn,
Hmm.
of course, says that, and maybe not as blunt as that. Like, I mean, nowadays we talk about sort of capitalism and making her do it. Well, I mean, in those days too, but it's
Hmm.
not that because Glenn always straight away comes in and says it's about the two chairs by the fire, and it's about the fireplace, and it's about the wife's parlor upstairs. That's what she craves for. She wants just the safety with someone. It's not sexual, or well, it might eventually have ended up being that, but it wasn't at the get-go. It was just the safety and being herself with another person of anyone. And I suppose that's what I suppose really touched me this time because I know we've said it about the great wonder where the sort of imperiousness sneaks through. But the second afterwards, where Helen does reject her, I mean, that's devastating, that look she gives. When she does kind of finally cotton on to, like, this is the reality, it's not going to change. It's like, this is rupturing something that she believes body and soul is going to happen. She's going to have her tobacconist shop. And it's, the doctor's line at the end. I mean, what leads people to live such miserable lives? I suppose that's what that really struck with me because it's the
Yeah.
basic sort of dignity of everyone, and I suppose maybe they are the moments where it does shine through. When you think of Pauline Collins as this, who I was amazed to hear when Glenn was on Graham Norton, they considered Miriam Margolyes for the part of Mrs. Baker.
Of course.
But oh sure, only one little maid died. You don't need to lock up my hotel because of the cholera outbreak. It's that thing that these people or the old manservant. That's God. You shouldn't be working at that age. I mean, they're the little
Hmm.
moments where I think it does succeed. And I think, as I said, when I
Yeah.
briefly glanced at that screenplay, it did kind of flesh out the ending because the ending is just completely rushed. But it did kind of flesh out more why Joe would have left for America and left Helen, as she says herself, high and dry and taken advantage of. The film
Yeah.
just cuts these scenes to ribbons. But it's that thing of just these dignified, ordinary lives, and
Hmm.
in every permutation, like people have always assumed it's about whatever the phrase would have been at the time, cross-dressing or whatever it is now. And it wasn't about that. It was a simple, lovely story.
Mm. Yeah, well, my thoughts on Glenn's performance, I will say, have changed over the years. This may be because I'm on a journey of watching every one of her performances in chronological order that I do find myself being maybe a little more generous than other critics. But yeah, this is definitely a performance for me that is most special in the subtlety and the micro expressions and the body language that if you're not properly engaging with the film, you might miss a lot of the choices she's making. But I think she does a very good job of inhabiting the sort of insular world of Albert, this very limited worldview that I mentioned earlier, where he's definitely gotten used to this routine that has allowed them to sort of operate safely, but cautiously as a waiter at this hotel for several years and has never risked going beyond those boundaries. So there is a very intentional sort of minimizing of himself whenever he's in rooms
Mm,
with a lot of people and wants to do the work and sort of leave it at that. And any kind of personal discussions that Albert might have with fellow staff members or guests at the hotel, he wants to keep that to a minimum because, just doesn't want to be detected or seen as suspicious. Like it's all very careful. And I think Glenn does nail that sort of nervous energy, especially with the suits too. That kind of helps to accentuate that intentionally made to be ill-fitting suits because Albert wouldn't have been able to afford nicer suits that were fitted to his specificities. So there's a slight clumsiness there that sort of enhances how you feel about the character. And then after Hubert arrives and Albert learns more about Hubert and the very comfortable life that Hubert is living with his wife, there is this very subtle opening up, I think, in Glenn's expressions in the way that I think is actually very specific to queer people in the LGBT community who might be either repressed or maybe in a predominantly, heterosexual or cisgender space of seeing someone who is like you and is seemingly living a successful life that naturally makes you curious and wants to either learn more or just like watch them very carefully or even to spend time with them. Albert kind of muttering to himself about these observations about like how Hubert lives with his wife and all these things. And I think I like that the film never overtly is saying these things, but I really felt it on this watch, like how difficult it would have been, especially at that time, to navigate the world as someone in the LGBTQ spectrum, to find others who are like you. And when you do find that, to want to draw yourself nearer to them. So I think in that way, the film is quite perceptive about queerness and identity, even if in other ways, it definitely falls short, you could say.
A moment
You
that
know?
stuck out to me that is, it's the scene where Albert shows Helen the property that he is going to buy and talks about like retiring to the seaside in 15 years. And that's the
Mm,
first, no, but that's the first minute that he has sort of some sort of playfulness or something, It's this is him
yeah.
allowing himself to do what anyone else on the street wouldn't think twice about. And I thought that was a lovely moment. It's that scene, and of course it's the famous scene of A Great Wonder. But even as I said, the moment after, which of course that Great Wonder scene was used as the Oscar clip, of course, and it stopped before Albert reacts to Helen's, what kind of a man would ask someone to marry them without ever having kissed her.
Yeah.
And that little moment, as you said, the micro moments, they are the thing that I will take from this rewatch. I certainly won't be. I don't think I'll be defending it as passionately as I did before, but I do
Hmm.
think that. Because it is very unlike anything she's on screen, at least. It's unlike anything she has done, before or since. And I can say that very lightly with anything else. As I said, even in The Wife, I think there are those grand, imperious moments. And there aren't really here. I mean, there are one or two that are just, muscle memory, maybe they slip through. But overall, it's so different and it's so. I remember at the time, people, critics were saying, well, of course, I mean, no, who would believe them for 1 minute as men? But
Hmm.
funnily, when I was watching it, I'm not saying it was some sort of, uncanny valley effect where you just watch it and then that's who they are. But I don't think that ever holds for any of these performances. Like, I don't think it with Dustin Hoffman and Tootsie, which is considered the best, or anything. It's just seeing them as a person, as a character, and it's those ultimately it's those taking it on maybe what the story's origins were just as a simple Irish sort of fairy tale that's where it's really works, but everything else
I think
now,
so.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I also want to talk about, I don't know if you'll agree with this, but there's a odd sort of comedy that I think Glenn
Mm,
plays in certain scenes,
yeah.
like in the scene where, Hubert is going to stay with Albert in the room, and because Albert is so used to being alone that he's just like in this blind panic
Mm,
about all of this. And those kind of like suspicious looks that
mm,
Albert would like give in
yeah.
in the room with Hubert as entering the bedroom, and like she does some wild business with her eyes too that is so
Mm.
theatrical and broad, and how stiff the body language is as she's lying down next to Hubert.
Yeah, and I remember,
you know
I remember when I went to see it, the people kind of snickering at that sort of unintentional slapstick
yeah,
comedy. I mean, that's the camp. Like that
yeah,
is what the camp stuff is because it's like the inverse of the idea that comedy is tragedy plus time. I mean, this is unintentional, broad stuff, as you say. It's slapstick, and
it's it seems like she's doing the theatrical version of this on
And that's
film.
the thing because they weren't intentional to elicit that response in those moments, but it is Glenn's power to glean that from an audience. Whereas when they are written as
Right.
such, I mean, they're like mommy dearest sort of stuff. The flea in her bodice. She might as well have had a wire hanger in her bodice. But it's not. It's not. Of course, it becomes that after the fact. That's why I suppose maybe it has with the queer community and that it has this reputation of this odd sort of film because it's I don't think it wants to be sentimental or mawkish or whatever, but yet it still kind of does go in for a lot of tropes or a lot of
Oh yeah.
whatever and certainly the music. I mean, it's that sort of main
Mm-hmm.
theme, the lay your head down when that's employed. I mean, it's like.
Mm-hmm.
You sort of feel like there should be a sort of, like applause now. It should be, try and squeeze out a tear now, should flash up on the screen.
Mm-hmm. Very that.
So and you'd wonder why that happened. I mean, did that happen in the editing room? Did that happen wherever? Um,
Mm.
because even in the promotion of the film, I mean, this song by Sinead O'Connor, like God, I think it comes up in the trailer. There's sort of a selling point. It's a bit like, when Taylor Swift or somebody writes a song for somebody now, that's nearly as important as who directed it.
Yeah.
But the song is beautiful. I mean, got a talented
Lovely.
writer.
Very sweet.
Yeah, I always wished
You know.
if she could have sang it as the sort of in memoriam at the Oscars or something one year. It would have been
Oh.
lovely. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah. Well, just to go back to that scene though, I did also want to pinpoint the scene where it's Janet's first line and notices Albert has just kind of like stumbled out of the bed and is making all this clatter and is just like looking Albert up and down and says, Jesus, you're a woman, with that very frank tone that always makes me laugh. Again, I don't know how intentional that is, but there's a kind of like you're a wizard Harry
Mm,
quality to it. But yeah, I think also though Glenn does, to her credit, play the aftermath of that quite well, of kind of like hiding in a corner and sort of covering himself up, not wanting to make eye contact. It's kind of like this real stress response kind of someone who is so like existentially panicked of being caught and what that will mean for him again, because like this culture, it's very repressive, but there's also this kind of like suspicious relief when Hubert kind of is assuring him that he won't tell,
mm,
in a sense that I think does resonate with a queer audience, of just having that safety in that way. And then there are also moments like the sort of guttural noise that Albert makes when Hubert shows him that he is in fact like has breasts, which is so also unintentionally funny, or maybe it's a little more intentional
mm,
in that scene. But I mean, Albert is like fully gagged by this, had no idea. Another funny expression is after Hubert tells him all about how like he eventually took on this male identity after getting away from his abusive husband and eventually is, married that woman Kathleen, and Glenn's eyes just like widen in this very funny way that's like, I didn't know this was even
mm.
possible, in a way like that you could live a happy life with some level of freedom under this new identity. So it's just this very strange tone, I think, watching the film, that it does feel like it's leaning into the sort of slight comedy of this situation, but like trying to ride the line of still making it a traditional drama.
Mm.
It's very odd.
Yeah, I would totally agree on that point. I think it's more when something is in such a specific time. I mean, it's certainly not because of the kind of literary origins of it. They could have done what they wanted with the short story. It would have, wouldn't have mattered. But it is,
Yeah,
it's the fact that like you can't force universality on something.
right. Yeah, I mean, just to sort of stop down on a few of those sequences that I find sort of curious. There's like one where Hubert is asking Albert to like just they're talking about their lives, and Hubert asks Albert his name and he says Albert, and Hubert says your real name, to which Albert very plainly says Albert. Like this is just who this person is now, and like the old self is gone in a sense, and that I do find fascinating. Like, is he doesn't see himself as that old self at all anymore. This is just who he is, and he wouldn't have the vocabulary we do now to really delineate maybe the identity in that way in a more clear cut sense. It's just he's Albert, and that's the end of it. It's not any more complicated, and that's not delved into in the film, but Glenn has talked about how Albert didn't even really have a name before Albert, because of the his upbringing and being adopted and such, and was just adopted by this woman named Mrs. Nobbs, and that's just Albert never had a name before Albert. I'm curious for your thoughts on that particular element of this.
As I said a moment ago, I think it's so charged by the like the really kind of problematic sort of transphobic thing that they invent for this screenplay about her being gang raped and taking this
Yes.
identity on it. I don't think you can really separate them. I mean, that moment is very touching of itself, but it is such a like God. I mean, it is like it is really a terrible sort of like victim blaming sort of mentality that really. I think it really
Yeah.
that is the great downside of the film as a
Hmm.
structurally because it's not some sort of like it's not like I don't think it's even played really as like a great gotcha moment or a great oh this is why this is Hitler not getting into art school, but it's sort of like a knowingness about the kind of whole even about like homosexuality in general. It's like that it's making out that it is so seedy and it's so whatever, I mean, through no
Yeah.
fault of the people themselves, through any of them. And it does have that. It's like it's almost like those like even in recent things, like even in that It's a Sin, like every person that
Mm.
was impacted by AIDS, all of them were punished. People that hadn't done a thing wrong. They were every character in that was punished in one way or the other. Totally innocent people, and I think it's such a trope. I mean, as I often talk about, like E.M. Forster when Morris his book was published posthumously in the 70s, like it was still shocking that those guys didn't kill themselves in the end in the 70s. This book had been written in the 1900s, and to think that this almost is in here as almost like a liberal sort of a viewpoint, like oh, it all makes sense that this is, and I think no, maybe I wasn't old enough to realize it at the time, but certainly on this rewatch. So I think
Hmm.
Glenn's little moments, she succeeds despite the material, basically, is what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
that's kind of really all I can say about that. But
It's a unforced error, like I said, in a modern context, especially for people watching like us 15 years later. And it does really play into those really awful stereotypes about trans folks and the idea of a trauma of some sort resulting in them taking on a new identity, quote unquote. And then Albert sort of like taking on this male presentation is essentially dress up and possibly even trickery. And so all of that is something that I think makes that part of the film age very poorly. I also think, though, that if we do think about this with a well intentioned eye that Rodrigo Garcia and company had from more of a feminist lens that I mentioned earlier, it does sort of track as this being the journey of a person who is trying to attain some control of their life and their situation. And these are the sort of somewhat unusual circumstances that led them to embrace this life. And it works for him, even though it's, you know, Albert's story is not going to be like most other people's and not even like most other trans folks. So, in that sense, I think that is what they're going for. It's just that there needed to be something worked out, I think, on a script level to,
mm,
not have it play into these awful stereotypes, like I said.
mm,
From there, I mean, I think we can also mention a little more about the dress scene. The dresses when Hubert and Albert go out and, for a bit of fun down by the beach. This is after Hubert's wife has died of typhoid fever. And Hubert notes that, like, his wife made these dresses herself and convinces Albert to run down the beach in these dresses. I do love Glenn's awkward, sort of stiff body language as he's like waddling out of the house in this bulky dress, like almost like he's fully forgotten how to even walk in a dress as a woman. But yeah, this is a very divisive scene, and it's one that I think rightfully has also received criticism from trans critics, and how it seems like Albert is now sort of embracing more of his true self in a sense as he's running down the beach in the dress with the wind in his hair,
mm,
and seems quite gleeful in the moment. But I think, again, to think of it as it's intended, it's almost like this sort of reclaiming
mm,
for Albert of a sort of childhood abandon in a sense of like, this is the one time where Albert can be free and the terror being exposed is no longer there.
mm.
And taken on its own, you can see where the issue is. But right after that, it's Hubert kind of assuring him that he can go back to his life now, that he doesn't have to be anything but what he is.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that scene again, I think it was I'm sure Glenn and John Banville and whoever thought this was the height of sort of liberal acceptance and progressiveness. And yet it plays as
Mm-hmm.
basically, gay men are gay people just like wearing, frilly gowns or something, That's how it seems. So it's
Yeah.
again the dichotomy between something that's well intentioned and something that is. both clouded by the kind of own, like by the sort of by the own, like the prejudices or just the biases of the writers, but also by the fact that it just does play for comedy unintentionally, you know. So it's the two things at once.
Yeah, and it's just the sweeping orchestral score underneath it all. It's just so overcooked,
Mm.
I think, unfortunately. So, anyway, Glenn also does have a touching scene that you mentioned a few times, actually, which is when Helen kind of questions whether he really loves her, even though he's now talking of marriage with her. He hasn't even kissed her yet, as she notes. This is actually another element that I find sort of quietly revealing in Albert as a character and showing how, like, zero sexual overtures have been made on Albert's part towards anyone for like however many years, 20 years maybe even his whole life, and that one incident he had was a traumatic one. And so being active and wanting to kiss Helen would maybe be going against his wiring in a way.
Mm.
So there's like this natural hesitance there, and also obviously a fear of getting caught and all those things. But it's partly, I think, the trauma of it all as well. And then the way Albert, of course, describes what it would be like to own a shop together and all of his future plans. There is this kind of simple, sweet, I think, desire to live a slightly more conventional life and just, have a humble life. And I do really love Glenn's line reading there. That is her Oscar clip of saying, "Our wedding will be a great wonder." That little pregnant pause in between. That's some classic Glenn magic there. And the eyes kind of light up in that moment. Like, that is what he wants at the end of the day, is this nice, simple life, and sort of to be able to use like the Love Simon parlance, to be able to exhale again, Simon, or Albert in this case.
Mm. No, that's a
Yeah.
perfect summation of everything.
Yeah, it's very sweet. And then unfortunately we get a very unfortunate climax with Joe confirming all of Albert's fears that Joe doesn't actually love Helen and is kind of a scammer who wants Albert's money and will abandon her for America. And Joe basically confirms this. They get in a huge fight, and with Joe getting very physical with Helen, that's where Albert steps in and attacks Joe, who then pushes Albert to the side very hard against the wall, hitting Albert's ear. And much like how he serves at this hotel, just kind of disappears very quietly, undetected, and lies down and is then revealed to have died by morning. It's very bleak, but also, I think you mentioned earlier, very rushed at the same time. Like, this all just happens so quickly in a way that I don't know if it is as dramatically satisfying as the film is wanting it to be, clearly,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So, and yeah, in the aftermath, it's, Mrs. Baker discovering Albert's true identity, and Helen is left alone with her baby that she had with Joe. But Hubert comes in and saves the day and is kind of offering a lifeline
Mm.
there in that moment. So, how are you feeling by the end of this film, having sort of, again, like rewatched it again and gone through the journey of Albert's very singular life?
I felt the whole thing was relentlessly noble and earnest and well-intentioned, and that's all I'm going to say
Yes.
about it when it was over. And I have no wish to
Mm-hmm.
ever, well, maybe on a transatlantic flight or something, but I have no wish to ever really watch it in the near future again, with all due respect
Fair
to
point.
our number one lady, Mrs. Len Carryu, and to poor Brenda Fricker, and to all the other people in it. But
Yeah.
I, no,
Mm.
yeah, but noble, well-intentioned, and good for
Very that.
Good for Glenn for ending her long post-dangerous liaison winter after 23 years. And it's a lovely sort of thing for the history book, or not the history books, but just for her own, I don't know, IMDb page. But yeah, that's it now. But at the same
Yes.
time,
A fascinating
yeah,
curio.
yeah. Oh, exactly. It's a curiosity, an oddity, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It also, like, I don't know if this is offensive per se, but like watching the film has sort of reminded me of a film that came out like 3 years prior, which is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, in the sense that it just kind of felt like it was just kind of telling this very unique story from centuries ago. And it's just kind of like, to your point, like even like in the original play or the novella, kind of having this sort of like lyrical kind of fairy tale quality
Mm.
in a sense that has kind of been like try to transfused at this point into something that is more traditional and stayed.
Oh
But
yeah, absolutely. It blows up the folds to kind of enormous proportions. I mean, like, F. Scott
yeah,
Fitzgerald's like paragraph that was Benjamin Button, and now it's suddenly about
hmm,
Hurricane Katrina, and it's about this, that, and the other. And
exactly.
but the same with this, because I mean, it's the Irish literary tradition of sort of storytellers and fairy tales and that, and now it's suddenly dumped into a very literal environment.
Hmm,
And I mean,
yeah,
that's when it really, you can feel it going down like cement, in those moments where it's so
yeah,
literal. And again, it maybe isn't as
hmm,
clunky as I imagined it would be, but by God, when those moments happen, it really, like, it's God, you want the floor to swallow you up and whatever.
hmm,
But maybe
yeah.
that's a
So
cultural thing with maybe Irish people. When I saw it first, maybe, as I said, it would play well elsewhere. I mean, because I mean it is always regarded as, Nicole Kidman and Far and Away is the other one, but it's always on the list of like the worst portrayal of Irish people. Just after sort of Darby O'Gill
mhm,
and The Little People is Albert Nobbs, who of course, isn't an Irish person himself. I mean, or herself. She's, a London woman from wherever. But yeah, it's I don't know, could they have updated this story maybe for the film, set it in like in a diner in the 50s or something? Because if a story like that is so
sure,
timeless, it should work in any context.
yeah,
Because, it's, as I said, it's supposedly, I mean, it's just generically set in the 19th century. Like, let's face it, it doesn't matter if it's 1860 or 1898, but no matter where it
yeah,
is, the environment around it isn't fairy tale, and it isn't and say something like, say, like even Yentl with Barbara Streisand. I mean, that opens with a sort of disclaimer that it's set in this kind of mythical version of Eastern Europe. Not really. It's not
hmm,
set in Czechoslovakia in 1904. It's set in a fantasy version, whereas this film doesn't have that except for Glenn's little asides. Otherwise, it's extremely literal, extremely so, like almost the effect of a
yeah,
docudrama sort of thing. It's like the way they
hmm,
always, I mean, those sets. I mean, they're always used for sort of, because obviously the places in London are destroyed, but every the time there's like a documentary about Jack the Ripper or something, they go to those sets that thing was filmed on because they look the same as they did in London and in Dublin too. And it's just so literal. I mean, you expect Jack the Ripper to come across the corner, and then you expect sort of the professor emeritus of history to, talk about it. Like, that is how literal it
hmm,
is. It's like a discovery. It's like it's
right,
something you'd see on the Discovery Channel or the History Channel,
yeah.
So
Which feels, again, very
yeah,
problematic in
yeah,
that sense. But yeah, just to sort of end on more of a positive note, I can definitely see the Glenn's passion is coming through quite well in the performance, and just I can understand her being so struck by this story and just kind of not being able to get it out of her head for so long, because it is such a singular life, to go back to that play title. And so worthy of more consideration for me personally than most
yeah,
people will just kind of dismiss it as, oh, that's that movie where Glenn plays a
yeah.
man,
It's
you know.
a, I don't know, a Pyrrhic victory or a stalemate, I think, as opposed to a failure. Um,
There you go.
but I do think, I mean, we've spoken ad nauseum now, but I do think what people have always said about a punchline or a sort of like it's a byword for sort of a awards bait awfulness. People say Albert Nobbs, you know what they mean. As I say, Kate
Exactly.
Winslet's projects are likened to it. I don't see Bradley Cooper. They never say Maestro is the sort of, thirsty awards bait, hokum
No.
that's just cooked up to, and it's not that either, but it's not some wonderful thing in its own right. So
Right.
it's again, as George Moore said, a
It's
perhapser.
complicated.
It's an unfinished person is what George Moore said. And I think this is
Yes.
an unfinished film, an unfinished project.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, I think on that note, we can get into the release of Albert Nobbs. So it premiered at the Telluride Film Festival on September 2nd, 2011. It toured most of the major fall festivals, including Toronto, Mill Valley, Austin, etc. Roadside Attractions then gave the film an Oscar qualifying run on December 21st before the film opened in limited release on January 27th, 2012, here in America, just in time for Oscar nominations to give it a bit of a boost. It was only in 245 theaters in the US, and it opened at number 23 at that weekend's box office. It was competing against a bunch of Oscar nominees of that year that were carryovers from December, alongside newer releases like The Gray and One for the Money. So, but Albert Nobbs made a little more than $3 million in the US and was $8.5 million worldwide. Critics were mixed, with many of them lauding Glenn and especially Janet's performance, but feeling that the overall film was kind of bland, and there were a lot of common types of words like claustrophobic or hermetic being thrown around as criticisms. So then when it came to awards, it was mostly seen as an acting play for Glenn and Janet, as well as for the makeup. It was only nominated for makeup at the Critics' Choice Awards. Glenn and Janet earned some critics nominations. Janet got a few more than Glenn, but both were nominated at the Golden Globes, as was the song Lay Your Head Down. SAG nominated both Glenn and Janet. Glenn won the coveted AARP Movies for Grown-Ups Award for Best Actress. So there's that. And then at the Oscars, from what I can recall, the makeup nomination was nearly certain. And Glenn and Janet were sort of seen as bubble contenders, but both of them were, in fact, nominated. This was Glenn's 6th Oscar nomination and her 3rd in lead, her first nomination since 1988 for Dangerous Liaisons. But the film didn't win any of its 3 nominations. Either way, I would say a pretty solid total in terms of awards for a film that got a pretty mixed reception and rather minimal box office. So any thoughts on why the film was received in that kind of way, that it wasn't universally acclaimed, obviously, but still managed to do quite well with awards?
I think it's because of Glenn's heart. It's the Andrea Riseborough effect, a decade earlier. I mean, and not in that cynical way of, literally lobbying voters. I don't mean that. But I think that was endearing. And I think that is the reason why ultimately she did get nominated, because it wasn't some sort of cynical, again, it was not lobbying, it wasn't some, that sort of thing. But it was endearing to people. It is. I mean, it's, and I think maybe because we were in a slightly more naive time in 2011 than we are now, say, where that sort of thing would be viewed with utter cynicism. It would be, she's rocking up to the opening of an envelope. She's schmoozing and she's, kissing babies. Whereas I think for someone that had been, apart from that year where her and Donald Sutherland were, the announcers, and she famously said about that Halle Berry was an Enema Award-winning actress. Um,
Emmy.
mm.
Like, she was really going through it.
But she was away from that whole world for so long. So I think there was a sort of a bit like maybe Annette Bening and Nyad. I mean, and again, similar because, she brought, well, I mean, I know Jodie Foster is a lot more beloved than Janet McTeer is. But I think again, Jodie Foster would have been more likely than Annette was. So I think that
Yeah,
that's
totally.
it's the same dynamic, that people admire that, and especially when somebody is so invested in it. Like this was something, as I said, it was her lifeblood for 30 years. It was not some, thing that they slotted her neatly into, that she didn't owe it anything. And as I said before, it was getting it seen. It wasn't getting a nomination. It was getting it seen widely. It was getting the word out. I mean, that's what the campaigning was. It really was.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because I mean, this thing would have been. Of course, I know. I mean, Glenn is hardly a pauper, but as opposed to say different years where she does have the Netflix machine behind her or the Sony Pictures machine behind her, this was, a homespun sort of affair. And not, but not amateur either, not, she's inviting all the members and she's going to cook them spaghetti like Diane Ladd or whatever. So I think that's why ultimately it did get these things, because when people do admire that, there's no two ways about it.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, I want to be careful with my words here, because when it comes to Glenn and the Oscars, especially in the 21st century, there is this prevailing notion, I think, that her nominations were driven by narrative and lifetime achievement. But I do think, to your point, Glenn did have a very powerful narrative, in that anyone who attended screenings with a Glenn Q&A after, which was probably a lot of them, would learn and probably appreciate how hard she worked to get this movie made, and give her that narrative to want people to invest in her, in a sense of being like, this is a woman in her early 60s now who is getting this passion project made, and this is coming right after or in the midst of Damages and all of the goodwill she had for that. And so I think all of that was kind of a perfect storm to really help propel this tiny little movie
Mm.
in front of voters. And so, yeah, I think that's a big part of it. It's obviously a very showy performance, very transformative, all of those buzzwords that we like to throw around during awards season. That, yeah, she probably just squeaked in, but I'm glad that she did get in for one of her passion projects.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's an extremely hard earned nomination. It's not crying in the shower like in
Mm-hmm.
The Big Chill or, the light coming
Yeah.
through her hat in The Natural. I mean, it's really so hard earned. I mean, she said that
Yeah,
herself. I mean,
exactly.
I'm not being funny. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that's exactly what she says. She cried in a shower in The Big
Yeah.
Chill and Caleb Deschanel lit her that way in The Natural.
Lit her
Yeah,
well.
that's
Yeah.
it.
Yes. I know. Yeah. Always so humble, our Glennie.
Mm.
And I can only hope, even though it's looking dimmer and dimmer by the day, that she can get her one last passion project made of Sunset Boulevard, regardless of age. She's very sprightly, as we said, and she reads as younger than she is. And so, it's just a very fascinating kind of parallel track in a sense, or like history repeating, I suppose, of fighting so hard for decades for Albert Nobbs and now fighting so hard for Sunset Boulevard to get made as a film. So
Mm.
we've always got our fingers
Yeah.
crossed. As you mentioned, some tragic gay will give her the money to get it made herself.
Well, that awful man in Washington, he with these mergers, he wants Paramount to make sort of, Rush Hour 12 or something. So I think he should lobby
Mm-hmm.
because Sunset Boulevard is his favorite film. It's the only, Mr. Trump. So, I'm sure he saw it on stage countless times. So, the one good thing that
Yeah.
man ever did. But yeah, but no, but
Yeah.
let's face it. I think we all have to make our peace with it that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
But to get to our last segment, we're going to rate Glenn's performance as on a very specific scale. So thinking about her performance and where this sits in her career, would you say with her performance as Albert Nobbs, she's ready for her close-up, which is to say one of her best performances? Is it low Glenergy, not one of your favorites, not an essential watch, close but no cigar, somewhere in the middle? Or we now, of course, have a secret category of Glennicent, meaning she is good, but the project not so much.
Hmm. I think it's the last one as opposed to Close But No Cigar, which everyone thought the height was
Mm,
of comedy, and the night after she lost for the wife, and it was Glenn Close But No Oscar, kind of.
of course.
But
Yeah.
no, I think it's the latter case because
Mm-hmm.
it's a lovely curiosity. I think you said it in one a few minutes ago. I think that's what we have to view it as. That just happens to have the nomination do it and happens to have whatever and has an unfortunate reputation, but it's not unearned, let's face it, the reputation. It's not totally fair, of course, but it's not some mad thing where they're pointing at it and there is grounds for it. And I think it's maybe just the
Mm,
sexism or ageism or whatever that colors it more with Glenn than it would for, any of these other vanity projects. But it's definitely the performance is much greater than the sum of her parts. And it's funny because
yeah.
it's not a case of like she's working with inferior people. She's working with people that she clearly trusted, clearly handpicked. So you can't say like that that's what's letting her down, as a lot of things do. A lot of other projects, you think, God, she did a lousy director, she did lousy whatever. That isn't the problem here. It's just the fact of what this film is. I think it was like, it was damned any which way. I don't think there was really, I don't think it
Yeah.
could have been, but her passion and her whatever saves it. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, that's what I would say.
That's
In
fair.
some,
That's totally fair. Well, for me, this is me being generous, but it is on the low end of close but no cigar. I will say that. She was so passionate about telling this story, as I said, and I think it does show, especially on the revisit, how she really has internalized this story, and I think is channeling some of the feelings of characters she's played in the past, like Alex Forrest, like the Marquise de Merteuil, who are these characters who dealt with sexism and patriarchal societies of their own, and in those ways reacted in much more active, expressive ways. This is a decidedly more passive
Mhm.
character and performance that does at times, frankly, make me forget that I am watching Glenn. But I also feel like there can just be such a distance from Albert to make me fully be bowled over by the performance at the same time. And the film is just flawed at
Yeah.
best. So I can certainly see why, and I admire that Glenn, regardless of, I don't know how much she has read of critics of Albert Nobbs or knows about that, but like, I think she has really maintained a certain kind of like conviction that this is one of the definitive characters and stories of her
Yeah.
career.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I said, it wasn't, unfortunately, like it wasn't shown, but she didn't select it for that thing for nothing. I mean, and
Right.
that just shows too, in a way, how her own, I'm not saying it's humility or modesty, but it's that she would think that that could, or it's not innocence either. I mean, it's not kind of Pollyanna sort of naivete, but that she would, as not a joke or whatever, she would pick this as the project, and not the one that
Mm-hmm.
that people would want to see. Like, let's face it. They obviously came
Right.
to her and asked her to pick the personal one to her, and she would choose this. She would like rank this in the first order with all the great triumphs. I think that's very touching, and it's not, as I said,
Yeah.
it's not some sort of as they'd say here, what's some sort of harmless sort of behavior, or it's not kind of like childlike. I mean, let's face it, she's been around the block, she knows these things. So I do think I just thought the fact that it happened only about 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was so
Mm-hmm.
touching because I, kind of thought we were talking about this. It really said, oh God, that's a
Right.
sign from a sign that, um, but no, but I think that's, if there's one thing it should not have that total reputation as a punchline. I mean, because it is, as I said, it's the byword for it, but there's more to it than that. But that is totally on her shoulders alone. It's not on the
Yeah.
film. It's not on the different aspects of it. It's totally her. Like, she is the embodiment of that project, and that's what it is. She's like what David O. Selznick was to Gone with the Wind. She is to this. And in a way that I don't think has been in any other thing, any other project, even one that she was so invested in, even that she, produced it, like the Sarah Plane and Tall stuff or whatever. Like, this is the sort of thing that I think if she was to die tomorrow, I'd say she'd say it's what she's most proud of, quite honestly.
Yeah. And I do admire that.
Yeah.
So, Mark, thank you so much for joining me. This was a quite an interesting probe into the life of Albert Nobbs.
Mm.
So, thank you so
Well, you're
much.
welcome. And probe is a very fitting title, given fitting
I
word,
had to.
giving the sort of phallic undertones of this. But no, it was lovely talking to you, Kevin, and always is, actually, to be honest, because the last time was great too. But it was lovely to speak to you, and yeah, I God never will turn down an opportunity to talk about Mrs. Len Cariou. So it
Of
was lovely. It
course.
was it was a great wonder.
Oh, that's great. We love our Glenn Cariou.
Yeah.
But where can people find more of you on the internet?
I am Mr. M.O. Mark O'Donovan on Twitter and or X, whatever it's called now. Vichy Twitter, I call it, and Instagram and
Mm-hmm.
everything. I'm that. And then on Substack as well. And but it's supposedly called Oh Shut Up, but I think it should be, please do. I think I should just change it to sort of M. O'Donovan Tobacconist. That would be a better title.
Yeah.
And there was a famous hardware shop in Dublin in those days called Nobbs and Knockers. And we used to call this film, as a
Oh.
joke, Albert Knockers instead of Albert Nobbs. But it's long gone
Wow.
now. So that's what this film was
Okay.
known to us as. So,
Wow.
from,
Well,
yeah,
I love
she
that.
was, they love,
Albert's legacy will live on through your Substack.
mm, that's a very heartening thought.
Isn't it?
Mm.
Yes. Well, thank you all so much for listening. You could find me at Kevin_Jacobsen on Twitter and Instagram, just Kevin Jacobsen, no underscore on Blue Sky. You've listened to my Oscar themed podcast, and the runner up is for coverage of every single Best Actress race, including one with Mark here, talking Liza and Diana Ross and all kinds of great ladies. That's And the Runner Up is on all platforms. And to keep up with the world according to Glenn on social, follow The Glenn Pod. Rate, review, and follow on all platforms. And with that, I will bid you all adieu.